Hi, everyone. Welcome to the community classroom. We're going to jump right into this topic. We are revisiting the name Israel. This is very important if it hasn't occurred to you. Time is of the essence in terms of a number of issues going on in the world right now. And this name presents a conundrum. And so we've talked about the issue of this name appearing to have multiple meanings and multiple dynamics with respect to etymology. And so you also have this odd historical dynamic about how this name came about. We're going to touch on that. And this is also tied to that issue of Barbados and Barbuda. And it's not so much what they call you, but what you answer to. And so this is a very important issue about what people are answering to and how people came to be known as Israel or AZRAEL, as this is indicating. And people need to get a handle on that. We talked about just earlier about false teachers. And if you follow a false teacher will lead you to the pit. And if you follow, you will generally fall in. And so it's important for you, for yourself, to get a clear understanding. Those of you who are calling yourselves by this name, it's very important for you to get a clear understanding of what this name is all about, how it came to be. How do you go from Jacob to a name such as Israel? You need to get some clarity about that because this is a very serious name with a very serious etymology, and there are some serious implications to this etymology. So hang on here. And reflecting back on the previous discussion, we found that Israel appears to be interchangeable with a number of names and almost basically is a replicate of Ishmael, and also in many respects is rooted in the name Esau. And so this is very odd how you go from Jacob to Ishmael or Esau. What's also important in terms of etymology is the root of this word Israel. And as you can see, you see that it is coming from two words, Sarah or Sarah and El or El, depending on how you're pronouncing it. This is a very interesting combination because it is stating that the etymology, when you're looking at this, is he will rule as God. If you'll notice, the God is in a capital G. So this isn't a small g, this is a capital G. So this is quite an assertion. And there is scripture that tends to back up that this is what is meant. He will rule as God. This is an ultimate narcissist statement. This is an ultimate narcissist etymology. But here it is. And also, if you have not noticed or you don't recall our earlier discussions about the current situation, you will see when looking at the current situation that the name given to the current situation is rooted in this particular etymology. And we're going to separate this out here so you can see it very specifically. So from Sarah and El, he will rule as God. And this is supposed to be the symbolic name of Jacob. Why does Jacob have a symbolic name? This Jisrael, this Yisrael, this Israel. Why does he have a symbolic name? And why doesn't he use his own name? And how did he come to have this name? And how did the descendants of Israel or Jacob come to be called by this name? And is this a legitimate moniker to be carrying? Is this a legitimate mantle to be wearing? And here for reference, we're going to go back beyond the King James Version. We're going to go into 1599, and we see here in the Geneva Bible, that version, that Jacob, in this narrative of Genesis 32, Jacob wrestled with a man. It specifically says a man. There's a conversation that goes on with this wrestling that goes on all night. Then the statement of, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. There's a conversation about Jacob's name. And then the man tells Jacob that his name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. What's interesting about this is the reason why Jacob's name is suddenly going to be called Israel. This is not Israel's given name, but it's indicated here because Jacob has had power with God and with men and has prevailed. Just sit there and meditate on that. And here we have the Wycliffe version. Again, we see that Jacob, Genesis 32, is wrestling all night with a man. And then Jacob's name is changed by the man. And he is then known as Israel. And it is indicated, if thou were strong against God, this is God with the big G, that Jacob would also have that power against men. This is a very, very odd narrative. And individuals who are identifying themselves as preachers, teachers, pastors, leaders, these things should have been resolved. These things should have been examined, and there should be clear indications about this name and the meaning of this name and the implications of calling oneself by this particular name, given the etymology and given the narrative that is here in Genesis. Now, more people are more familiar with the King James Version, and this version has some very important information in it. This is pretty deep here. So again, you have a man that Jacob is wrestling with, and the man gives Jacob another name, which is Israel. What's interesting here is the man makes reference to the current global situation that we are dealing with, the name given to the current global situation that we are dealing with. And here is this reference to prince, which is related to Sarah or Sarah, or you get it. And so it says here that as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Explain that. Somebody really needs to explain that. I have yet to hear the explanation for this narcissistic narrative that's going on here. This is a megalomaniac narrative that is going on here. Again, you have this big G, and you have this person, a regular human being, according to this narrative, gets renamed by another man, and that name indicates that this person is not only on par with God with the big G, but has prevailed, that supersedes the entity known as God. And so we're going to revisit some of these translations, these transliterations of Israel. And you can see it seems to be very common that the S in Israel is replaced with a Z. And you can see that this is detected as a Slovenian derivative. And you can see when you're looking across languages, whether you're looking at Haitian Creole or you're looking at Gujarati language, you can see that that Izrael is translating to what people would typically think of as Israel. And you see continuing a recognizable variation of this in Amharic. And continuing on, when translating from the Slovenian to the Tamil, you see Israel in the standard English spelling. In the Yoruba, you see an I on the end of it, so Israeli. Continuing on, you see that that Z, it continues to translate even into the Latin and the Greek into what you would recognize as Israel. And here you can see, going into variations of Hebrew, that it also translates from that I-Z to the I-S and Israel. And here you get into something that looks a little political in terms of the translation, but that's not completely clear. But you see here that Israel, coming from Slovenia, does still translate into the Arabic as the word Israel with the S. There are some other indications down below, but again, those seem highly politicized. In doing the research, an interesting dynamic emerged, and that was a relationship between the name Israel and the name Azrael. And that Azrael is with an A instead of the I and a Z instead of the S. And so you've seen it with the IZ, and now you see this variation with the AZ. And this is in the ancient Tamil, going from Azrael to Israel, and you can see that it is seen as synonymous. So this is very important, and we're going to look at this name Azrael and see that it has important indications, which then brings up the question of why teachers are not talking about this. Those who are identifying themselves as spiritual leaders, spiritual teachers, pastors, preachers, why isn't this being addressed? And here you see this interesting translation dynamic again with Azrael with the A. Now it's substituted with an E, all still meaning the same thing or having the same etymology, having the same roots, having the same pronunciation. And here we see this odd discussion in Encyclopedia Britannica about Azrael. So Azrael in Arabic, you see a number of other spellings there. In Islam, this name is supposed to be associated with the angel of death who separates souls from their bodies and is considered one of the four archangels. You can also see down there that we've looked at this spelling before. So we've seen this variation as a variation of Israel before with the Israel. There's also a counterpart, supposed to be a counterpart in Judeo-Christian tradition, with this entity also being known as the angel of death, going by this name. Azrael is supposed to be of cosmic size with 4,000 wings and a body that has as many eyes and tongues as there are living human beings, and sort of stands between heaven and hell, basically. And here we venture into the Jewish Virtual Library, and we see an additional discussion about this Azrael. And one of the indications is that Azrael is associated with this idea of a cruel snatcher of souls, the angel of the Lord who smites and destroys human beings. And then there's a reference to some scripture in 2 Samuel and Isaiah. This entity is also called the destroyer. And you see here another reference to this dynamic of the angel of death in this story, in this narrative, being full of eyes so that nothing escapes this entity. And it is pictured as an old man holding a sword dripping poison into the mouths of mortals. Given that this is coming out of Jewish tradition, a question is, why hasn't there been a reconciliation about this interchangeable nature of this name Israel and Azrael, and that very unusual narrative about how this name came about that is contained in Genesis 32. And here you see yet another spelling, and you see the AZRAEL, and this is a part of Jewish Islamic folk legend. And again, this Azrael is the name of the angel who removes the souls from the dying bodies. We're going to quickly look at some of the World Heritage Encyclopedia information related to angels, and you can see that variation of Israel there, and the title of this particular source is Azrael. This information really begs the question of, how did Jacob get this name Israel, Azrael? How did this really come about? This is a very odd narrative. Very odd implications, almost an indictment on this whole situation here. So anyway, you have Azrael again, and you see all of these transliterations there. Again, indicating is often identified with the archangel of death in Hebrew, Sikhism, lore, and as well as in Islam. And then you see those variations in terms of spellings down below. And again, all of these interchangeable dynamics. And you see Israel right there with the Z versus the S. And the name, according to what they say are adaptive forms of Hebrew, whatever that means, is that this name is synonymous with one whom is helped by God, is in many ways blessed by God. Again, this is very odd given the narrative that is in Genesis 32, looking at a variety of translations, of early translations. Now, here we see that, continuing with the same source, we see that there is no reference to Azrael in the Catholic Bible. However, there's a story in 2nd Esdras that does relate to this name. And there's some indication that Azra and Ezra are also interchangeable. But then you also see yet another relationship, another notation about yet another archangel. You also see that there is an indication that this name is spelled interchangeably in terms of that E and that A, and so you have Israel or Azrael. This again is very important and definitely requires a little bit more research, particularly given the fact that this name is significantly tied to the current global situation that we are dealing with. In fact, it could be said that this current situation is named after this particular dynamic that we are talking about with the Sarah and El. Now, this is not to say that people should stop calling themselves by this name or that everything should change. However, people do need to get a handle on what it is that is going on with this name, how this name came about historically and in terms of scripture, and then get a better understanding about the extent to which this is an appropriate name for an entity who was originally named Jacob, who now is known by this other name, and then people identifying themselves as descendants of such. There has to be an explanation for this, particularly given all of the implications of the etymology of this name, and then the folklore or the narratives that surround this name in not only past times but also in current times. There's nothing to indicate that this has changed. This name still continues to carry this particular weight, and so it's definitely something that needs to be examined, needs to be addressed, and those individuals who are identifying themselves as teachers, preachers, leaders, they should be able to address this adequately and in a way that makes sense for everyone. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.